forget. Okay. Nick Seaver, work with the consortium since it launched, along with Gideon. We both work a lot of op-eds, place dozens and dozens a year, and we love talking about this. So what we want to do today is try and give you the basic structure and the tools to write an op-ed and pitch it yourself. I'll give you a little bit more context, but first, Gideon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Hey, everyone. My name is Gideon Hertz, and as Nick mentioned, we work with the Medical Society Consortium. I've also worked with them since the beginning. I'm an Associate Vice President and the Deputy Director of our training programs, and work on a number of different issues, from climate change and health to medical education, to basic science and translational science, and all across, across many others, and across all of those, writing and helping with op-eds. So excited to share some knowledge with you today and chat with you about your opportunities.
So we would love to have you drop in the chat just maybe where you're based. We actually have a goal here. So we have an hour-long session, but we're going to try and get through the start, the components of an op-ed in the first 30 minutes, in hopes that then if someone does want to duck out to one of the other sessions, you can fit into. In the second half, we're going to do more of a conversation about how we sort of edit our own op-eds, how we pitch them to reporters or to op-ed editors, and actually brainstorm specific ideas for you all with you. So we'll go into breakouts and just sort of workshop some ideas. So we hope you'll stay for the full hour, but we'll try and get through the core of it in the first 30 minutes. If you have questions, please feel free to drop in the chat. Gideon will flag because it's hard to look at all the screens at once. So feel free to interrupt. There might be some questions we punt to the end just so we can try and get through the core in those first 30 minutes. Great. So again, for those of you who've joined, we encourage you to be on camera. We know life's happening, makes it more interesting for all of us. We can see if you have questions, but we understand if you want to stay off camera, totally your call. Okay, so I think there are a couple key points we really want you to take from today when we talk about writing op-eds. And the first thing is, oftentimes people want to write an op-ed and then place it. And that's only half the story. We really want folks, once you've placed an op-ed, the way we have the most impact is what we do with it then. So it might be sending a link to your legislator. It might be sharing it with listservs of the medical societies you're part of or other organizations. But part of our job in writing op-eds is to reach even beyond the readership of the publication where we have it placed. When we think about op-eds, it's good to think of it as an argument, and not in the combative way, and we'll get into that, but we're arguing for something. Typically, and it varies by outlet, they're between 650 and 850 words. Generally, I would say target like 700, 750, but if you're writing for a specific outlet, you always want to just check their website and see what their guidance says. And if you can't find it, sometimes what I'll do is just copy and paste one of their op-eds into a Word document and do a word count myself just to see. So when we talk about an op-ed, it's a call for change. We want to be talking about what we want to be different because of an op-ed. It's controversial, and I have that in quotes because it's not that we want to be incendiary or contentious or confrontational, but there needs to be some tension in our piece. If it's just something very agreeable, folks aren't going to be as interested in it. So we want to think about how we find the tension of the issue and help people see that they agree with you and support your action. Critically, and this is one of the most important things, a good op-ed is written in your voice. Sometimes we edit and place a lot of op-eds. They'll come to us, and I think one of the things that we'll struggle with is that we could take any one of your names and put it on an op-ed because it's written more like a white paper than an opinion or an argument. So make sure you're infusing yourself, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They're evidence-based. The ones that are going to have the most impact and be persuasive are rooted in evidence. They have to be relevant. Unfortunately, the work of climate and health inequity is relevant every day. There are always things we can point to, but we have to make it clear to the audience why it matters to them now. And finally, it has to be specific. And we'll get into this when we talk about refining arguments. But if we try and cover the giant issue of climate change and all things that is climate change in 600, 700 words, we're not going to do justice to it. So we're not going to be persuasive. It's also helpful to name what an op-ed isn't. It's not just a pontification or a reflection. Sometimes people just have thoughts they want to share, and there are places for that, but the op-ed page isn't really that. Op-ed editors want something that are going to attract eyes. And so that's a critical piece. It can't read as self-promotional. And this is really hard because often your expertise is rooted in the fact that you are doing something on these issues of health and climate. But at the same time, the fastest way to get an editor to reject a piece is if it looks like you're selling something or promoting yourself or your program. There are ways to work in your work. I always say, if you're pointing to 3 examples of solutions to climate change that advance health and equity, only one of them can be something you're connected to, and that should probably get the least attention. There are ways to balance it in and weave it in, and you want to be transparent. But the second tips into, hey, look what I'm doing, or perceived that way, editors are going to pass. We don't want to be preachy. We want to be engaging people where they are. We want to be talking about shared values. But if it reads like you are, coming down to tell people something they should know, it's not going to be as impactful. There are a lot of places where you actually can publish explanatory pieces. If you're with an academic institution, The Conversation is an outlet that loves those, and it's a really great opportunity, but that's not quite an op-ed. So we have to be arguing for something, not just explaining it. And we don't want it to read as a platitude. I think the key thing here is that really successful op-eds are op-eds that we couldn't put anyone else's name on other than yours. It's coming from your unique voice, your expertise, and your experience. So think about why it is you're writing it and what you have that maybe not no one else on earth has, but only a handful of people. And this is the great thing about targeting state level and local newspapers or news outlets for op-eds, is they're interested in local voices. That's part of what makes you unique to them. It's helpful to look to op-ed editors to see what they want. I'll just read this highlighted piece. This is an older piece of advice from a past New York Times editor. But writing your own voice, if you're funny, be funny. Don't write the way you think important people write. It's focus on something specific. Similarly, if you get a rejection with an op-ed, don't give up. Don't be defeated. There are lots of reasons they're rejected. Some of these, this is from Kevin MD with MedPage. This is literally his automated response. He lists reasons why there's rejected, too many typos, topic has been covered, it's just not of interest. Editors are people, so you may run into one who's just not interested in what you want to talk about, and that's why we always want to look somewhere else. A few guidelines for op-eds, and I'll pause in case there are any questions, and then we'll just dive into the 7 pieces of an op-ed. We want these to be timely. That's the thing that's going to make an editor publish it now. If it's what we call an evergreen piece that could publish tomorrow or in 3 months, it's going to be harder to place. So if there is a wildfire near you, if there is a heat wave, don't try and publish a piece 2 weeks after the heat wave. Try and do it while the heat wave's happening. And some of these things, we know they're going to be heat waves. You can anticipate it, you can write it in advance, and update it and pitch it when it happens. The hardest part of writing an op-ed is to make a single point and avoid tangents. there are a lot of really critically important things that you all might want to put into an op-ed, especially on this issue. The challenge is to pick one and sort of stick to that. You can always write more op-eds, so just make one point really well. Don't be coy as you're writing an op-ed. Sometimes people think they want to like build and have a great reveal at the end. And that only works if someone actually reads the full piece. And we know a lot of people are reading the first couple paragraphs and moving on. So you want to get your argument clear at the top and sort of right out of the gate. Something that is oftentimes hard for experts is in writing this sort of writing to be personal. Inject yourself with all of the parameters of protecting the privacy of patients. Think about how you can talk about your experiences and the experiences of people you're working with. And finally, you want to use an active voice and you want to use short sentences and paragraphs. It sounds really superficial to say that short paragraphs are the thing that make an op-ed, but it really matters. If you think of yourself at 7 a.m., 6 a.m., picking up a newspaper, the first cup of coffee, and you see just big blocks of text, I'll be honest, I'm less likely to read it. And so you want to make it easy for people. I think an example of this that I'll just quickly point out, this wasn't an op-ed, it was a news story. This is several years old, but this was the opening of a news story. 12-year-old DeMonte driver died of a toothache Sunday. A routine $80 tooth extraction might have saved him if his mother had been insured, if his family had not lost its Medicaid, if his mother hadn't been focused on getting a dentist for his brother who had 6 rotted teeth. By the time DeMonte's own aching tooth got any attention, the bacteria from the abscess had spread to his brain, doctors said. After 2 operations and more than 6 weeks of hospital care, the Prince George's County boy died. It's a powerful story, and the way that it's told is critical. That we could give you a whole case study on the impact that this article had. Massive investments in the state of Maryland, but just focusing on the writing style, we took basically all the same words and turned it into how someone might write it as a single paragraph block and longer sentences, and it just doesn't quite have that same impact. So think about the impact of each sentence when you're writing an op-ed. Does anyone have any questions they want to drop in the chat? We have just a moment before we dive into the parts of an op-ed. All right, well, we can have a big discussion at the end as well. So when we think about op-eds, it's easy to sort of think about it formulaically and feel like that's not going to be effective. But the secret of op-eds is they're kind of all have the same parts. There are exceptions that sort of ride on the power of their writing and the impact in the moment. But at its core, op-eds should have these elements. As an argument, an audience, a so what / why should I care, a why now, evidence, an acknowledgement of a counter argument, and a call to action. And we'll dive into each of these. The first thing, and I usually start with this, is you need an argument. You want to be able to state in a sentence the entire thesis of the piece. And often I find this to be a very iterative process where we start and we say, okay, what do we want to say? I'm talking with Gideon, he wants to write an op-ed, I'm coaching him, or he's coaching me, as often is the case. We might say, okay, so what do we want the argument here to be? And a very valid thing that we would hear is, climate change is a global threat that we have to rise to meet. We all agree with that. On or off camera, you're probably sort of nodding and thinking, yep. And so I would probably say, okay, Gideon, let's be a little bit more specific. Let's hone in on this. What do you want to argue? What do you want to make clear here? And so you might say, okay, well, I guess to be more specific, climate change has to be a priority for the Biden administration because it's a health threat. And you know what? It actually aligns with their commitment to focusing on equity. So I'd say, great, Gideon, that's a sharper op-ed where that's probably placeable. But let's just go a little bit deeper. What should we do about it? And so Gideon may say, well, Biden-Harris administration must ensure that all agencies are considering how policies improve health, climate health, and health equity, rather than maintain or deepen an unfair and unjust status quo. In fact, the Department of Transportation and Agriculture have unique levers to be able to do this. That's longer than I would want in a perfect world for the single sentence summary. But I use this as an example because it's actually a piece. And we're going to walk through this. This is a piece that is written by Mona Sarfati and Linda Rudolph and placed in The Hill in their Changing America op-ed section. So we worked on this op-ed, and we'll sort of break this down as we go. And we'll drop in a link to this in the chat as well, so you can actually read the full piece. But so we've thought about the argument. The next question is, who's my audience? Who do I want to read this? Who is it really important actually sees it? Not the world, not the general public, but really who specifically. And so in this case, we would say, okay, the officials in the Biden administration, it's Secretary Buttigieg and Vilsack. At the time, I think they had just been nominated. And policymakers more broadly, because this is we're holding these up as examples. A note on this: sometimes you actually want to start with who your audience is before your argument. So these two can sort of refine each other and sort of co-evolve as you're working in an op-ed. But try to avoid the temptation to write to an audience that's everyone. Because when you write to everyone, you don't really know anything about them, and so it's hard to sort of connect through the written word. The next piece of an op-ed is the so what. This is the why should I care. When you think about this, for a reader, it's sort of beyond altruism. Why should they care? What's in their interest? How does it impact things they care or value about? This also sort of has to do double duty, because for an editor, we have to answer the question, why is it important that people know about it, and why will they want to read it? It can't just be, the vegetable. It needs to have something that makes people want to come to it. In this case, the so what was there was a new report talking about how 8 million people would die from breathing pollution from burning fossil fuels. So it was tying into people's health. That's a pretty good reason for a reader to care. And the good thing is, if you all are focused more on local publications, we encourage you to go to national too. But there's incredible power in doing this locally, because you can talk about the localized impacts of climate change. And that is one of the most powerful tools we have. That's actually hard to capture when writing for a national audience. We need the why now. Literally, why does this matter now or tomorrow? Not this year, not this month, but why now? And so this piece actually sort of had three. One, it was fresh off of Inauguration Day that we were writing this. There was new research released, so that adds a sense of urgency. And HHS had just announced the Office of Climate and Health Equity. And so those were sort of three, which sometimes you can add a few together if none of them are now immediately. We need evidence. We want to think about the evidence that will convince people. Evidence alone it won't work. We need emotion and values and experience. But when we start to think about different types of evidence we can put in an op-ed, there's actually a lot of power and ways to put in evidence that will resonate with different types of folks. So some types of evidence we encourage you to consider: reports and studies. That's going to be really persuasive to certain audiences, especially to policymakers. Data points. You don't want a data dump in an op-ed. One or two, maybe three well-selected statistics can be helpful, but you don't want to overload. Things you've experienced personally. You have a personal connection, a family connection to this. Professional experience, what you see with the patients that you might work with. And case studies or stories. Oftentimes, I think, especially those of us who have come from maybe more of a research evidence background, we don't like to think of stories as evidence. But it's really powerful. When we're writing, we want to be touching different parts of people. And so balancing different types of evidence is going to be a really good way to pull people in different ways. In this piece that that we're talking about, we had several pieces of evidence. There was action already happening, past campaign statements in the case of Secretary Buttigieg, a recent memo from 68 health organizations. So there's a bunch of evidence we wove in. Finally, or almost finally, one of the really hard pieces here to include in the right way is a counter argument. This doesn't mean, in this case, that we're indulging climate denial. We're not doing that. But if you think about the best intentioned person who might disagree with what you're saying, the best version of the counter argument, find a way to acknowledge it and set it aside. And that's going to help people pull people in. It shows that you're not an ideologue, you're coming with a nuanced understanding. And the trick is not to spend too many of your limited words on that, because then you're actually making the case against yourself. So there are ways to do this really briefly. Often we'll call this like the to be sure paragraph, because we'll start, to be sure. Some might say that, you know, the climate crisis isn't as important as COVID because COVID is here, and so the Biden administration needs to focus on COVID, you know, if we're getting that time machine. I don't agree with that. I think we can do more than one thing at a time, and maybe that's your rebuttal. In this case, our counter argument rebuttal was, this work isn't just about avoiding the worst harms from climate change. It's about improving health and creating more equitable country on our journey toward a safer, more secure country and world. It was sort of thinking that some people are thinking this is just about the worst outcomes. And you'll see this more in the piece. We'll drop the link in. And you need some sort of call to action. You want to leave readers, and this is especially important with climate change, where we know if people don't feel like there are actions they can take, they're actually likely to disengage more. So think about something that your reader can do. In this case, there were clear calls to action to Secretary Buttigieg and Vilsack. I'm going to show you one other example of an op-ed, and to make this last point. This was a piece in the Arizona Daily Star by former Surgeon General Richard Carmona. Another piece, a good example of sort of a local angle into this. And every op-ed needs to have an engaging opening. In this case, in the Surgeon General Carmona piece, it really dove into 3 examples of climate impacts that Arizonans had been feeling in the last couple months. So the opening line was, over the past 3 months, Arizonans in the nation have faced 3 challenges you know well, but the dial on all 3 seemed to be turned up. And then went into each 3. You just, again, picture that person drinking their first cup of coffee at 6:30 in the morning. What is the sentence that's going to pique their interest and make them want to read more as they're skimming the paper? And then you want a closing that matches. In this case, the health of people in the United States has been my life's work, but at the end of the day, I'm a father and a grandfather, and I want my family to breathe easy, grow up safely, and prosper in a stable country. I want that for everyone in Arizona and around the world. The trick here is closings are often, and we didn't really do it in this case, you can kind of think of it as like a good stand-up comedy act. If you're a fan of it, you'll know that often the first joke is something they come back to and reference at the end. And that's because as an audience, it's really satisfying to be part of it, to be in on it and to know. And so it's a really nice device to reference your opening when you close. Okay, so we have those 7 pieces. So you might be thinking, like we actually have little cards we'll hand out sometimes when we're in person, where you can fill it out and then move the pieces around. But there's a really standard opening or structure that works well. And so if you're just getting started in op-ed writing, I would encourage you to take basically the structure and run with it. You want to start with a strong opening that grabs attention. You want to make clear your main point. You want to get to the why now if it's not already clear. You want to introduce your evidence. You want to acknowledge the opposition argument with a brief rebuttal. You want that pretty close to the end, but not the last thing. Insert a call to action and end strong. And remarkably, that is the core of an op-ed. And we are at time if anyone does want to duck out into one of the other sessions. But what we're going to do next is talk about, have a discussion. You know, want to have some Q&A. We don't want to just talk at you for an hour. Brainstorm some ideas, talk a little bit about how to edit your own writing, excuse me, and how to actually figure out who to pitch and how to do that, because that's a little bit of a black box for folks. So does anyone have any questions? We just introduced a lot. You don't need to go back to the main room if you're going to stay in this session. I'm going to pull back the full list of parts of an op-ed in case anyone has questions on those. I know we just gave you a ton of information. Can you give me with the reaction button a thumbs up or an actual thumbs up if that tracks, if you feel good about those elements? A great question here. Can you use these awesome points? Thank you. For writing a letter to the editor? Yes, sort of. A letter to the editor is usually about 150 to 200 words, maybe 250. Again, it depends on the publication. And you don't really have room to do much with that. So I honestly think when writing a letter to the editor, you really just kind of want to focus on the argument. Usually it's something like, you know, in reporter X's piece last Tuesday, you know, insert the name of the piece, it raised really important points. As a doctor working in Phoenix, here's what I think people need to know on top of that, or where we need to pay more attention. And it's really a couple sentences. So it's think about your audience and focus on the argument, and probably the why should they care. So it's really the first three, I would say, make up a letter to the editor. And crucially for letter to the editor, Nick, sorry, just to chime in, I think that obviously, as Nick mentioned, the format is much different. It's much shorter. It's usually in response to a specific article or other piece from the paper, and it has to happen pretty quickly after that piece. So while an op-ed, you're waiting for a moment in time, you're not necessarily responding to a specific article or another piece in a newspaper or news outlet. Letter to the editor is directly writing about something that they've published, and you know, usually you have a day, maybe two, to get that in. They don't tend to run, you know, last week letters to the editor unless there's sort of a section like that. And I'd add, sometimes people try to respond to an article in an op-ed. There are maybe a few outlets that would let you do that, but in general, think of the distinction between letter to the editor and an op-ed. As the letter to the editor is responding to something from the news division, that's something that has been in the paper, and an op-ed is sort of introducing something new to the paper. So they may have covered wildfires, and you're introducing a new idea around wildfires. Mary Lee?
Oh, thanks. So I don't so much have a question is, this is so incredibly helpful. So who writes good editorials? If I want to like look for other examples, not necessarily climate, but what publications have some of the better editorials?
It's really interesting. I mean, obviously the national papers are going to be, they are incredibly competitive. So the pieces that are selected and published there are really sort of the best. Sometimes they are maybe more narrowly focused on the range of topics they cover. Luckily, climate is certainly in that range. one thing is you're looking, always look at the byline, because unfortunately newspapers spend a lot of their editorial section with columnists who are paid staff.
Yeah.
So if you were to pick up a print copy of the New York Times, for example, one or two might be op-eds, and then there are probably 3 or 4 columnists like David Brooks or Tom Friedman or Paul Krugman. And so a columnist and an op-ed editor aren't competing, or an op-ed writer and a columnist aren't directly competing, but there's limited space. The good news is online, there are more options, but just pay attention to that. They also get to get away with writing things that an op-ed submitter would not get to write.
Yeah, I think that point is really crucial as you're looking at the various editorial pages, is that when you're looking for good examples, do make sure that you're looking at op-eds versus editorials written by columnists at the publication, because they are doing a completely different thing. They're not having to sort of follow a more specific guidelines. They're able to do some things that we're not. And Nick, just to flag here another question in the chat, which folks, if you're welcome to throw questions in here, but this one from Wendy: how much does it matter who you are for national or regional media? Seems like those with academic affiliations or some other prominent position get published more.
Yeah, they will say that it does not matter how famous you are, but there's a shockingly high percentage of famous people who have op-eds published in national outlets. It matters, especially in the national outlet level. Regionally and state, it matters less. What really has currency for them is local voices. So if you're in Utah and you try and write an op-ed for the Boston Globe, good luck. You're going to need a really good Boston angle to get through. So it does help to have a credential or a source of expertise, and that gets back to that thing of the piece should be written in a way that only you really can make that argument. I'm seeing a question. Local paper never says op-ed submissions, only lets the editor. If they don't have an op-ed section, I wouldn't try pitching there. But look at their op-ed letter to the editor section and actually see what they're publishing, because some outlets don't sort of abide by the clear lines and separations, especially as you get to smaller publications. So look and see what they have. In worst case, or the most you might have to do is just send an email and ask.
Yeah, I would always recommend asking, especially for local papers, because they will, as Nick said, they may not distinguish. Sometimes they call them something different. So if you're just searching, for that local paper and op-eds, nothing's coming up, but there's a perspective section or a community voice section or commentary section. So look for all of those, but when in doubt, it's worth just asking.
All right. So looking at time, I'm gonna suggest here are a couple questions that once you've drafted a piece, I like to ask myself is, take a red marker to it and see how long it is. They're rarely, if ever, going to make exceptions to word limits, because it's, for some, a matter literally of printed space, so they can't. You have all the appropriate elements. Is the other side not acknowledged to the appropriate degree? Not too much, not too little. Another question here, what to do after an op-ed's published. We don't have a slide today on things to do, but encouraging other people to share on social media, even giving them language to use can be really helpful. Encouraging newsletters of organizations you're connected with to include that if they do roundups of news. Think about sharing it with policymakers. Just send an email saying, hi, I just wanted to be sure you saw this piece I wrote in the local paper, thought you might, find it interesting, it's relevant to your work. And we can go a little bit more into that as well later at the very end. For the question, what do you mean by map it out? So this is a technique I will sometimes do where if I'm feeling stuck by the flow, I will literally sort of, instead of outlining a piece and then writing it, I'll write it and then I'll outline it. Because what you'll sometimes find is, if you boil each paragraph down to a sentence and then just try and read the high level outline, something doesn't work. And sometimes it's just a matter of moving something or deleting it. So that's sort of what we're thinking about there. Let's spend a little bit of time. Let's go to breakouts. Oh, we can't do breakouts because we are in a breakout.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to instead, let's talk a little bit about pitching your op-eds, and then just if we're a small enough group, if anyone has an idea of an op-ed that they want to workshop in real time, we're a supportive group, so we'll help each other out. We can do that. But often the question we get is someone has an op-ed they want to write, but they don't really know where they want it to go. We encourage you to start by thinking about where you want to have it published, because then you can write to match their style, their word length, things like that. But there are a few questions we sort of start with. It's always good to pick two options because very often we're going to get a rejection. It's not about you often. Occasionally it is, but more often it's that they have another piece, they have too many pieces. It's a competition issue. So the first question is, think about who is it you really want to read it. You may actually want everyone in your state to read this piece, and that's fair. But if you have a call to action, who is that has the power to make that call to action? So we went with that piece to the Hill because it was really important that we wanted people in the administration to see it, and that's a publication read by people in DC. The piece by Richard Carmona, the calls to action were sort of implicitly to elected leaders in Arizona. So you go to an Arizona paper, which they're monitoring very closely. The next question is, are you trying to reach a geographic community? If you're trying to reach doctors, rather than maybe people in your area, you might want to go to Stat News or MedPage. So the population you're thinking about, is it geographic? Is it professional? Is it trade? Things like that. When you know about your audience, think about who they actually read. The reason that I know that US senators closely monitor their state newspapers' opinion pages is in college, I was an intern for a US senator in the press office. And one of my painfully boring jobs was to skim the 7 or 8 newspapers in Montana every day I was there, looking for anything that mentioned certain topics. So mention their names, mention the issues that are prominent. And then really practical questions to, I think, maybe Teresa's point. Does the outlet actually accept op-eds? How competitive is it and how time sensitive is your piece? And we'll talk about this in a second. And does what you want to say align with what they're looking for? This point about the competition and the timing is because oftentimes we'll send an op-ed to an op-ed editor, and they might take 3 days to review, they might take a week, and we can only do so much. Literally, the New York Times gets 700-800 submissions a day. So it is a process to be seen and you slip through, and so there's a process. But I think there's sort of this balancing act of if you have something that is timely and only going to be interesting in the next week, maybe instead of trying to go to the most competitive outlet imaginable, go to one that's going to reach the people you want to reach and maybe has less sort of cachet, but actually has more impact. We have a colleague who used to work on the New York Times editorial section, and he made the point recently, like, everyone wants the New York Times, but actually CNN has a much bigger readership. So if we take our own ego or maybe where we'd love to see our name out of it, we can actually have a lot more impact sometimes. Because it takes time to review and you have to let it sit with them, like we said, if it's within a week or two of the news hook, aim towards places that you're going to get a response. And of course, if something emerges and it's very time sensitive, submit it, wait 24 hours, and then call and say, are you interested? Generally, I don't recommend calling on an op-ed unless it's incredibly timely, because they're going to say, resend it. You know, that's kind of all we get. And it's frustrating to them and frustrating to us, and it's better just to send it again with a note saying, just want to be sure you saw this. If you're trying to figure out who to pitch, you know, you figured out, okay, I want to go to this newspaper, certainly reach out to all of us. We have databases that we can pull from. We can also Google, like this is often what we do when we don't have access to an outlet. I'll type in, you know, Sacramento Bee, op-ed editor, or submitting an op-ed, and just see what comes up. Usually there's something that will tell you how to do it on their website. You can always pick up the phone and call their main line and say, I'd like to submit an op-ed. Can you tell me where I should send it? And when you're given an individual editor, if there's also like an op-ed at thehill.com, just copy that too, because it helps decrease the odds that it's just missed. Does that make sense? Any questions there? The last step is actually writing the pitch. And really, it's a lot simpler than it sounds. You want a 2 to 3 sentence email probably, and it should answer these 3 questions. Because the only goal of the pitch note, which literally what we're talking about when we say that, is an email where we paste the op-ed in the bottom and we put a couple sentences above, and we want to tell them why you should be the person they're listening to on this, why now, and what. And so here's an example from that Hill piece that we have walked through today. I sent this along and said I'm writing to submit this piece. The what, it explores what cabinet members can do to build on their promises. Why now? People are about to be confirmed for these positions. And then why these authors? You can put in affiliations. This is kind of actually the best place to drop in maybe a little bit of like bragging. Say maybe you're a chair of a subsection of a medical society, I don't know. Or you have multiple roles. I don't know what it is. You don't want to brag in an op-ed piece, but this is a place where you can sort of be like, hey, you should listen to me. I have some expertise on this. So I'm going to stop there. I would love just, if there are any other questions, thoughts, reactions, if this feels feasible, if it feels like too much, or if anyone says, you know what, I have this idea I've been thinking about for an op-ed, share it, and we can talk through in real time how we might sharpen it or build it out. We will sit with a little bit of silence in case anyone is feeling anxious about coming off mute. Oh, go ahead, Mary Lee.
All I want to really say is thank you so much, because I've been asked to do an editorial or an op-ed, and I have been procrastinating for about 4 weeks. So this is very helpful. It gives me a form and a direction to move in. So thank you very much.
And I'll note, if you're writing for like a medical journal, an editorial, that's going to be different. You're going to want to follow their norms and sort of look at what they publish, but that's a different process as well. Wendy?
Hi, thanks. I asked that question about, do you have to be a big shot? Because I'm a rural doctor and I can easily get things published in my local paper, but I'm in California, but if I try for the San Francisco Chronicle or the Sacramento Bee, that's not my locality. And I have had zero luck. So I've actually kind of had given up on trying to write op-eds. Do you think it's a waste of time?
No, I don't.
For me to do that. I have to say I've written a bunch and I've never gotten not one published outside of my rural community.
Yeah, and I don't think
they were bad. Yeah.
Yeah, just want to reiterate first that actually local papers and like smaller circulation have huge impact because the messenger is local and relevant. That said, I totally understand what you're saying. I think when you're writing about it, if you were trying to go for, the San Francisco Chronicle and you're not close to San Francisco, you want to think about how you can make the piece about San Francisco and then tie yourself to the issue. So maybe you've witnessed something in your community that is going to be coming to San Francisco. Maybe you have, I'm trying to think of what a challenge is that your community that's not knowing where you are.
I think the thing is that the rural voice is really important and doesn't get much play outside of our own communities.
And I think, this is actually where like national outlets, where you can be a different voice and you can lean into that is really powerful. Yeah. So it may be that you want to skip over the local and go towards the national and make the point that, I come at this issue from a different perspective. That's going to have some power. Gideon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to expand on that a little bit because I think that's right. If you're thinking about sort of the San Francisco Chronicle, even the LA Times to a certain extent, those types of publications that feel more national, feel bigger, you can still really think about those as local in the sense that they're looking for local angles for pieces. And so I think that I totally understand that frustration and them not sort of covering the rural voice. But to Nick's point, unless there's a local angle for the San Francisco Chronicle, they're probably not going to be as interested. And I think that's where it's important to sort of look potentially beyond that, go a little bit more national, where if the issue is relevant, there might be a better chance. The other thing is always look at sort of trade publications, which is a little bit of a jargony communications term and a little bit outdated, but those publications that are dedicated to specific types of audiences, like for folks who know, Stat News is a heavily sort of science and medicine based outlet that's a part of sort of an offshoot of the Boston Globe, and has publishes a fair number of op-eds that are written towards sort of the perspective of doctors and researchers. Nick mentioned Kevin MD and then Page Today. Think about those types of outlets as well. When we talk about, those are technically national outlets, but they're not the Washington Post, New York Times of the world that are, getting 800 op-eds a day. They are a little bit more targeted. And of course, you have to adjust your approach and your voice and who you're talking to in those outlets. But there can be some real value in sort of honing in on a broader but more specific audience.
And I think something that relates actually to many states is there are some major urban center papers that are statewide. LA Times is on the edge of being a national. They're interested in things that are California wide. I think from past experience, San Francisco is more interested in San Francisco than San Francisco Chronicle. So if you're looking at larger papers in your state, think about which ones are interested in sort of the state and which are in their area. That might be helpful too. So you might have more luck with the LA Times.
Nick, we've got another question in the chat here. Is it better to write as an individual or as the representative of a group? I'm the president of AMWA Georgia group. Want to have more of an impact? Is it more likely that an op-ed would be printed if I'm writing as an individual?
So it's actually not an either or. Every op-ed, and you should provide this when you send it to them, has what we call a byline, which is like, Dr. Nick Seaver is an MD practicing at, Seaver Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Obviously, all that's fake. Maybe there's a Dr. Seaver there, but you have a chance to introduce your credentials. So including that you are the president of an organization is actually helpful. It does give some cachet, and you don't need to write the actual piece in a different way. I want to put in a little bit of a caveat on that. Sometimes people want to write for an organization and they use a lot of we statements in the op-ed. You don't want to do that. Talk about I and you, because that's, again, what an editor is going to resonate with. If it feels like a policy statement from an organization, they're not going to be interested.
And always crucially, when you are sort of giving your organizational affiliation or your credentials, it goes without saying, but double check with that organization. If there's comm folks there, obviously as the president, you have a sense of sort of what you can do, but it's always good to check with those folks to make sure that you can submit the op-ed, that there's, you're able to say that, and they can also, if you're in an organization that has an active sort of communications presence, they can help with a lot of, the writing, potentially with the pitching, and certainly hopefully with, sharing the op-ed after it's published. So obviously it depends on the size of the organization and all of that, but it's always good to double check when you're going to include it.
Another question we get a lot that I bet one of you is thinking about is the question of co-authors. You want to write a piece with a friend or a colleague. In general, we encourage people not to do co-authors because, one, it's really hard to write from a shared voice. Like, it's a little bit awkward and just doesn't flow as well. But also, often when people want to do that, it's because they have someone else from their shared perspective. And so you don't need a second voice to make it work. The pieces that work as co-authored pieces are usually something with, the sort of strange bedfellows, if you will. It's people who you wouldn't expect to be writing together. So, we actually sort of stretched it a little bit with that piece by Mona and Linda that we've talked through, because arguably that could have been in one person's name. We did some work to emphasize sort of different perspectives, but writing, something with a climate scientist and a doctor, those are different perspectives that might complement each other nicely. We supported the consortium on a piece a while ago with two former surgeons general, and one had worked in a Republican administration and one had worked in a Democratic administration. So that's sort of an exception, and we sort of talked about like working with different administrations, even though it wasn't a strong divided amount of people. And then we also talked about their different focuses when they were Surgeon General, and sort of found ways to weave those together. So, any other questions or thoughts, or if anyone has an idea of an op-ed brewing that they want to talk through? I'll also share this slide here because I think sometimes people, if you're working with an editor, they might provide edits or feedback, and people don't really know like what are their rights. Ultimately, they can say no, but you have control over your story and your argument here. And so if an editor gives you edits and feedback, if you don't like it, don't accept it. If you like, maybe it's not your favorite thing, but you're fine with it, I'd go with it because they're the gatekeeper here. But you want to be as responsive as humanly possible. Think about it as a long-term relationship, especially if it's a more local outlet where you can start to build a relationship. You don't want to pitch an editor or something every 2 weeks, but a couple times a year you might want to. There might be interest there, and you can even then ask, like, would you be interested in more? Are there other topics you're looking for? But just know that you are the expert on your perspective and the content as well. And so you can push back politely and kindly and collaboratively. Any other thoughts? To the point of sort of preparing for news hooks, I would say you all are in different parts of the country. If you look ahead over the next 12 months, I bet every one of you can think of a way that you will see a climate-related impact on folks' health in your community. So start to write it, and you can write an op-ed, put it, save it on your desktop, wherever you want to put it, and just be ready to go. And you can then replace a couple sentences and say, if you're in a place that's impacted by wildfire smoke, you could just write it and put a blank for the name of the wildfire and a blank for the number of miles the smoke is reaching. I mean, these are unfortunately increasingly common and really pretty predictable. So you can be ready to go with that. Any other thoughts? I think another thought that we were talking about on our team just recently in terms of op-eds and thinking about how to activate with local media, especially on this topic, is thinking about ways that you can help localize the big national stories that aren't getting coverage. We've done a lot of research looking at how climate change and health is covered in different types of outlets and at different levels. And local press are not covering it as much. The fact that they're not covering climate as much and they're not covering climate and health and equity really almost at all in sort of the research we've done. Of course, some places are different, but thinking about ways that you can tie the big national issues. So an IPCC report comes out, most people sort of feel like that's something big and far away. And like, I'm sure a sad number of people have no idea what the IPCC is, and that it is the International Climate Organization. And so if you think about how you can help translate those big global national things that feel far away into a local audience, that can be really helpful. I'm seeing a comment here from Robin Cooper. So the difference between how you use an op-ed and a letter to the editor. We briefly touched on this. A letter to the editor is a chance to respond to something that's been in the paper, about 150 to 250 words, depending on the outlet. And it's really a chance to say, I don't want to say what a story missed, because that sounds like you're criticizing the reporter. You want to be helpfully adding to what they've offered. I mean, if it's a really terrible story, you can write a letter to the editor saying it's a terrible story, but in a constructive way. So it's a way to sort of add on to the story that's happening there. Whereas op-eds are a chance to introduce a new idea that hasn't been covered, or a different way of thinking about a big, an issue like climate change that has been covered, but not covered in the way that you're interested in. And it's more of an opinion-driven piece. Thinking about ways that you can infuse stories in op-eds is also a really critical piece to this. The opening can be a story, and very often you'll see in op-eds is a very short story, like a couple sentences. And what we know is that op-eds are actually a really persuasive tool for engaging readership, more so than just sort of a story. So it's a really important tool. And we also know that stories are really impactful in helping people to see and understand the health impacts of climate change. And so if you take both of those tools and combine them together and do some really good storytelling in an op-ed, it can be a really impactful way to communicate. All right, any other last questions? If folks don't have questions, I think we just a minute ago got the 5-minute alarm. So you can actually exit back to the main room and start to convene there if you want to bio break or anything. We're almost back to back to the main room. So, but also if you have questions, we're here and happy to talk about them.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is sort of along the line of storing things up, but you know, the health voice has not been heard much when it comes to ag policy, and there's a lot there's a lot that goes on, especially around dietary guidelines, and we always seem to miss the boat. And so I was wondering if you have any suggestions about that and sort of lining things up ahead of time, way ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a really hard one. About a year ago, I was working with someone as they were trying to write a piece on sort of agricultural policy, climate, and health, and it's a beast to take on. 700 words. It's complicated. So I think the more that you can find ways to put it in the perspective of the consumer, because we are all consumers of food and the food system, we just don't think about the food system behind what we see on the grocery store shelf. So thinking about from the perspective of someone picking up their food and what it means, and all that goes in sort of on the health side, and then climate. It's an important story that we haven't, I don't think, collectively done enough to tell.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of it in terms of when the decisions are being made, in terms of you know, USDA type policy and influencing that.
Yeah, that I think is a great option for like a Hill, like the Hill, or publications that are focused towards policymakers. It really depends on the ask that you're making. So I think it's a good question. I don't have a perfect answer right now.
Thanks.
No worries. Oh, we're being pulled out. Sorry, there was one question that we missed about outlets, but there are a lot of really great newsletters that we signed up for. Times Climate Forward, Grist, Inside Climate News. It's a good question. We should put it back in the main group because a lot of folks will have good ideas. So we'll see you in the breakout. Thanks so much.